We are back in Portimao. Now, if we remember last year, the DRS zone was a bit too long, which made the overtaking a little bit too easy. However, this year they ended up shortening down that DRS zone and gave us a second one in hopes of giving us some more wheel-to-wheel action this year. Was that the case though? We're gonna get into it. Here's the standings so far this season. And now it is time to review the Portuguese Grand Prix. Cass, what were some of the highlights in the first half of this race?
I think one of the biggest themes overall for this race was just the general lack of grip. A lot of drivers really seemed to struggle to get those tires up to speed, warmed up. For example, you saw Checo kind of drop off just a little bit at the very beginning. It seemed like he was struggling to get them warmed up, but it did allow us to see a lot of different overtakes within the first few corners.
You had those on the softs making extreme gains on those trying to warm up their medium tires. Next thing you know, while we're going down the main straight, we see the front wing of Kimi underneath his car. He ended up getting involved with a collision with his teammate. As a result of this incident, Kimi had to pull off to the side of the track, bringing out our first and only safety car of this race.
The safety car was out for 6 laps, which I felt was quite a long time considering Kimi was able to pull out next to an escape road. But nonetheless, the safety car restart I personally found was significantly more exciting than the actual start of the race.
And so we had Valtteri leading the pack. As we know, he likes to bunch up all the drivers to try and catch them off guard. In this case, it did work because Lewis was not prepared for this restart. But on the contrary, Max was a bit more prepared for this restart, as you could see him get the jump on Lewis and make that overtake into the first turn.
We saw quite a few different, very interesting overtakes after the safety car restart, but I think the one that caught everyone's attention the most was when Lando overtook Sergio, but went outside of track limits. It wasn't long before Perez was flagging this down and saying that he wanted the position back, but the question was when Lando would actually concede and return the position to Perez.
Eventually later on, Checo did get past Lando. Not sure if it was, like he said, him giving the place back, or if actually Red Bull had the pace to overtake the McLaren.
This also brought up all the questions around tire degradation. It seemed like Lando's tires were wearing off a little bit more quickly, as well as the Ferraris, so this was when the pit stop strategies all came into play. And it felt like every single time that we saw a pit stop, especially in the first half when drivers were starting to come in after completing their first stint, a lot of them were struggling to cope with the potential undercut because even though the pit stop window was quite short, it took a few laps for drivers to really get those tires activated. So even if you had a gap on the person coming in behind you, there wasn't a guarantee that you'd be able to maintain that lead despite coming out in front.
And now we were waiting, anticipating who of the top runners would come in first to try the undercut. And for the bulk of this first half, we saw the train of Valtteri, Verstappen, and Lewis all within DRS of each other. That is until Max ends up getting a bit too much of oversteer around one of the turns, and Lewis is able to make the jump on him on that main straight. From here, we're now just watching to see if Hamilton is going to be able to overtake Valtteri, which brings us to our halfway mark at lap 33. And so Cass, when looking at the first half of this race, from what we just covered here, how'd you score it?
I was not overly generous with this race because honestly not that much happened. My excitement was probably at a 4 just because it was cool to see some cars getting a bit of a jump on another. There were some mix-up within the leaders, but overall, I think pretty early on you could see that not that much action was gonna happen here. As far as the racing, I gave it a 5.5 because there were a decent amount of overtakes, but it was all taking place at the same overtake spots. You essentially knew that depending on which side of the track the driver would defend going into turn 1, the driver behind would just take the opposite line and most of the time get a clear getaway from there. And then as for drama, I had it way down at a 2 because other than Kimi losing his front wing and Valtteri getting a clean getaway on the restart, not much happened after that. It was mainly waiting to see if Lewis would recover from his mistake, which he did, and it did not take him that long to recover. So when combining my scores for the first half, it puts it at a 3.8, so I'm just gonna bump it up to a 4.
When comparing my scores to yours, I was a bit more generous with this race. My excitement was still up at a 5 for this race. We came in, there's still a fight for the championship, and Max was making overtakes on the Mercedes. I wasn't sure at the halfway mark who was still going to win this race. And that was mostly because the fact the top 3 still had yet to pit. And as we've seen in the past, sometimes that could go terribly wrong. In terms of the driving, I did score it a 4. Like you said, that first DRS zone was just too powerful. However, I was still content to see the top 2 teams challenging each other. In terms of the drama though, I did score it a 4 in fact, because I did find those little bits of drama in the start of this race that you might have missed. Take for example the fight between Perez and Norris. Would he have gotten a penalty for it? Would they have had to gone to the FIA after the race? We'll never know. So when you combine all those scores together, it comes out to a 4.3. I'm going to bump that up to a 4.5 myself. So now getting into the second half of this race, can we say it got more exciting or less exciting, Cass?
The second half of this race really came down to pit stop strategy with the leaders. We weren't sure if Max was going to try to pull off the undercut, but he ended up being the driver out of the top 4 that would bite first and switch to a new compound. This obviously meant that Mercedes had to respond, so within the next lap, they bring Valtteri in, but the pit stop was not that good. So he only ends up coming out about a second in front of Max, but because his tires are so cold, he couldn't get them heated up in time. Both of them had the back ends of the car just sliding back and forth, but ultimately Max had more grip and was able to get by.
Next, Hamilton comes into the pits, and Perez is actually leading the race at this point.
It must have been really frustrating for Perez though, because he's out in the front, he's trying to build a gap, he's trying to make these tires last as long as they possibly can, and yet he's faced with Mazepin ignoring blue flags and literally almost running into him. Mazepin ended up getting a 5-second penalty. Not that it matters, he was a full minute behind the back markers. Ultimately, it resulted more in Perez being somewhat of a placeholder to hold back Hamilton in order for Verstappen to close the gap, but he wasn't able to hold him off for that long.
It was really funny the moment when Hamilton was getting past Perez, because he was on the radio saying, "Blue flag, come on, why isn't he just letting me by?" But he didn't know he was actually in P2 that whole time. And then you see the likes of Red Bull bringing in Perez to switch over to the soft tire to at least remove the chance of Hamilton taking that fastest lap point and giving it to Perez instead.
With Perez setting the fastest lap and Mercedes realizing that they have enough of a gap that they can bring Valtteri in for a free pit stop to attempt to steal it back. He does so, and then Red Bull follows suit and brings Max in for a free pit stop, and it keeps going on from there. And then the funniest little bit at the end was Lewis asking if it was worth to come in because he also had a large enough gap to second place, ultimately deciding, nah, not worth it, would rather claim the lead without any potential issues in the pit box.
The race ends off here with Lewis taking the win, Max in second place, and Valtteri in third. So an interesting added new twist to the second half of this race over that fastest lap. How did that impact our scores?
My excitement remained at a 4 just because, once again, it was pretty clear where the top 3 were going to end off on. You knew as soon as those pit stops had happened that this was the finishing order, and that was kind of that. There were some good overtakes happening in the midfield, which is why I put the racing up at a 5. You had Alonso just kind of quietly but also very aggressively making his way through the field. I was also getting stressed out watching Ricciardo inch his way closer and then have some threats from Gasly. But then there were also some sad moments, like watching Carlos kind of drop off and fall out of the points that Ferrari just seemed to really not react well to those mediums. And then for drama, I bumped it up slightly from the first half. I had it at a 4 just because of all of that very strange last lap pit stops, and Max gets it, but then track limits, and then he doesn't actually find out till after the race, and it's just a little bit of confusion. So that puts my second half score at roughly a 4.5.
My excitement was just like yours at a 4. I was still going into the second half, unsure of how it was going to finish off, especially for that second place. And it was really stressful to watch at times because it looked like Valtteri was catching up, and I really wanted Max to just hold on to second place to keep the championship as close as possible. For the racing, I scored it the same at a 4. There was a lot of good fights going on in the midfield, but one fight that was really fun to see on the TV was the battle between Mick and Latifi. Although they were at the back, those two were racing each other hard. And now for the drama, it's a 4 as well. The drama, like you said, of that fastest lap battle. You didn't know who it was going to. Also, just the fact that these teams were putting their drivers' whole races at risk with those pit stops. Fortunately, nothing went drastically wrong for any of the drivers in their attempt for the fastest lap. except Max might disagree. So with 4s all across the board for me, it obviously scores my second half as a 4. So when you combine both of our scores together, the final score for the Portuguese Grand Prix of 2021 is a 4.25. So this is where the Portuguese Grand Prix stands against all the other races so far this season. Next week we're going to Cass's favorite track in Spain. We all know how that race went last year. Who knows, it could shock us this year. Be sure to let us know down in the comment section what you thought of this race. If you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave it a like while you're down there. Hit that subscribe button and that bell, because you know we're going to be posting another race review for the Spanish Grand Prix.
As per usual, make sure to follow us on social media at CCF1 channel to hear all that we have to say throughout race weekends.
And we will catch you in the next video.
Bye!